Inside a federal archive, I found 22 photographs of Pennsylvania Station, a building erased above ground while the railway beneath it kept operating. The survey documents its Roman-scale waiting room, glass and steel concourse, and underground tracks before demolition removed the monumental shell by 1964. Then, one detail changes the entire story. The platforms were not destroyed. They were retained and rebuilt beneath the replacement. The official logic was practical. New York still needed trains, not an imperial waiting room. But that room had never been accidental decoration. It was designed to make arrival in the city feel important. Why preserve the system that carried people into New York, but erase the architecture that told them New York mattered? The federal record has a number, HABS-NY-5471. The Library of Congress catalog lists 22 photographs and 7 historical data pages. It names McKim, Meade, and White as the architects. It records the building as demolished. It records what replaced it, Madison Square Garden and a new underground station. The archive does not describe an unknown ruin. The dates, designers, engineering program, and ownership are documented. Pennsylvania Station was placed into regular service in September 1910 as part of a vast Pennsylvania Railroad project begun in 1903. Before that project, the railroad could not enter Manhattan directly from New Jersey. The North River stood between the company's tracks and the city it wanted to reach. The answer was not a bridge or a waterfront terminal. It was a system of tunnels beneath the river, carrying trains into Manhattan below street level. That engineering decision shaped everything above. Because the tracks were underground, McKim, Meade, and White did not have to wrap the station in the conventional outline of a visible train shed. They could place an entirely different object over the railway, a low, monumental structure surrounded by colonnades, more civic palace than industrial shed. Inside, the sequence of public rooms rose toward a waiting room, based on the Roman baths of Caracalla. Tiny passengers crossed the floor beneath vaults, built at a scale that seemed to reduce the individual while enlarging the meaning of the journey. Beyond it stood the concourse, covered in glass and steel. Stone authority gave way to exposed modern engineering. The traveler moved from the visual language of ancient Rome into the mechanical world of electric light, metal, platforms, schedules, and trains. This contrast was deliberate. The historical survey states that the owners wanted the station not only to serve the railroad, but to embellish New York as a monumental gateway. The building was part transportation system, part civic announcement. You were not simply arriving at a track number. You were entering the city through a carefully staged procession. First, the colonnades, then the great room, then the filtered light of the concourse, then the descent toward the hidden railway. But one detail refuses to fit comfortably into the later story. When demolition began in 1963, the railway did not stop being necessary. New York still required the tunnels, platforms, track connections, and passenger circulation beneath the site. The underground station levels were retained and extensively reconfigured. New support columns were inserted through the complex so that Madison Square Garden and the replacement structures could stand above an operating railway. The machine survived. The ritual surrounding the machine did not. The Library of Congress gives 1964 as the station's demolition date, while the National Park Service describes the destruction campaign as extending from 1963 to 1966. The difference matters because the disappearance was not a single theatrical instant. It was a process. Stone came down while trains continued below. The monumental shell was separated, piece by piece, from the transportation system it had been built to dignify. The strange part is not that an old station was replaced. The strange part is that the railway could continue after the architecture of arrival had been removed, proving that the two had always performed different kinds of work. One moved bodies. The other told those bodies where they had arrived. The accepted explanation for stations like Pennsylvania Station is not mysterious. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, railways were new institutions of extraordinary capital, technology, and social power. They moved people at speeds and scales that earlier generations had never experienced. Their terminals became gateways to cities, advertisements for railway companies, and public demonstrations of engineering confidence. The architecture had to organize passengers, but it also had to persuade them. A railway company was asking ordinary people to trust iron tracks, steam power, tunnels, bridges, timetables, and enormous corporate systems. Classical architecture offered a visual language already associated with order, permanence, government, wealth, and authority. The station frontage could provide the reassurance of a bank. Behind it, an iron and glass train shed could display the power of modern engineering. Historic England traces this pattern to the mid-1830s, when major urban termini in Britain became increasingly lavish. Their long architectural frontages expressed both the capital value of the railways and their growing commercial and social importance. One of the clearest examples appeared in London in 1837. At the entrance to Euston Station stood Philip Hardwicke's Doric Gateway, later known as the Euston Arch. 4 massive columns framed the approach between the capital and the Midlands. Its form came from Greek ceremonial architecture, but the arch was not needed to support a railway roof. It did not carry the trains. It did not power the locomotives or control the signals, and with open iron gates and small lodges, it could not realistically conceal the vast industrial train sheds behind it. That was not its function. Its purpose was announcement. The traveler approached a new industrial machine through a structure that resembled an ancient ceremonial threshold. The railway was presented not as temporary machinery, but as an institution worthy of stone, proportion, and public awe. That is where the pattern begins. 1 year later, in 1838, Hardwicke's architecture appeared again at Birmingham's Curzon Street, the northern terminus of the London and Birmingham Railway. The Curzon Street principal building used 4 enormous Ionic columns supporting a full classical entablature. Historic England describes it as Greek Revival architecture applied to a revolutionary new building type. Behind and beside that facade stood the actual apparatus of railway movement. The classical building did not need to resemble a locomotive, a factory, or an iron shed. It performed another role. It gave the new technology a face the public already understood. Curzon Street survives as a Grade 1 listed building. Its Ionic front now stands almost like an isolated temple beside railway land, a surviving control example for what was lost at Euston. Look at the two structures together. At Euston, Doric columns announced the railway. At Curzon Street, Ionic columns gave institutional dignity to the terminus. The forms differed, but the message was similar. This machine belongs to the permanent order of the city. The official explanation is persuasive because it accounts for both symbolism and practical use. Monumental halls could help orient large crowds. Entrances could organize circulation. Clocks, doors, ticket rooms, and waiting spaces could make an unfamiliar system legible. Grandeur was not mechanically necessary, but it was not meaningless. Architecture could reassure. It could guide. It could advertise. It could transform corporate infrastructure into civic experience. And as railways expanded, the station became one of the places where the industrial age explained itself to the public. But the explanation contains a tension. If monumental architecture helped establish confidence in the railway, what happened after confidence had already been established? Once the public accepted the train, once the tracks were embedded beneath cities and the system became ordinary, did the architecture lose its purpose? Or did later generations simply stop recognizing the kind of purpose it served? Pennsylvania Station reveals the first crack because its destruction separated function from meaning with unusual clarity. The underground tracks were essential. The waiting room was not. The tunnels had to remain connected. The Roman scale interior did not. The station levels had to be reconfigured beneath Madison Square Garden. The colonnades, vaulted room, and monumental sequence could disappear. From a narrow engineering perspective, the decision was coherent. Trains require tracks, platforms, signals, circulation routes, and structural support. They do not require a waiting room based on the baths of Caracalla, but the building's owners had never claimed that the waiting room was required to move trains. The historical record says it was intended to embellish New York and serve as a monumental gateway. Its value belonged to another category. It made arrival visible. The old station placed the passenger inside a sequence of changing scales. The exterior was broad and low. The waiting room expanded upward into Roman volume. The glass and steel concourse revealed the technological world beyond. The platforms waited below street level, hidden beneath the city. The railway had no conventional shed visible from the avenue because the train system was underground. The building above was therefore unusually free to become architecture for the act of arriving itself. This is where the official explanation becomes incomplete. The explanation tells us why the grandeur was built. It does not fully explain why the grandeur later became so easy to classify as expendable. In London, the same tension had appeared 2 years before demolition began at Penn Station. The Euston Arch was listed. It attracted major public opposition. Prominent preservationists defended it. Yet it was demolished in 1961 during the rebuilding of Euston Station. The railway continued without the Greek gateway. Again, the machine survived while the ceremonial layer disappeared. Historic England connects the outrage over the loss of the Euston Arch to the growth of stronger attitudes and regulations surrounding architectural conservation. The public response suggests that many people understood the destruction as more than the removal of obsolete masonry. Something symbolic had been severed. The arch had stood at the threshold between London and the Midlands since 1837. It had watched vehicles, luggage, travelers, and generations pass between its columns. It had been created when the railway itself was new enough to require a monumental introduction. By 1961, the railway no longer needed to introduce itself. It had become infrastructure, and infrastructure is often judged by what it can process, not by what it can mean. The same logic reached New York. Pennsylvania Station could be treated as two separate objects, a transportation plant below and an architectural shell above. The lower object remained valuable because trains depended on it. The upper object became negotiable because its work was psychological, civic, and emotional. But psychological functions are still functions. A monumental hall can orient the body before a sign is read. A vaulted ceiling can make movement feel ceremonial. Daylight can reveal direction. A colonnade can slow the transition between street and interior. A vast shared room can remind strangers that they are participating in a public system rather than passing through a service corridor. None of this turns stone into machinery, but it changes the human experience of the machinery. That is the first crack. The loss cannot be measured only by asking whether trains continued to run. They did. The deeper question is whether continuity of operation can conceal a break in civic experience. Beneath Madison Square Garden, the railway remained alive. Above it, the architecture that once explained the journey to the city was gone. The records explain the construction. They explain the tunnels. They explain the reconfiguration. But they do not settle the feeling produced by the before and after contrast. Tiny passengers beneath immense vaults, followed by the compressed underground replacement serving the same fundamental movement. The system still delivers people to New York. What changed was the kind of New York waiting to receive them. The pattern expands beyond Pennsylvania Station because ceremonial railway architecture appeared almost as soon as major railways did, then continued across different nations and different historical styles. In Washington, D.C., the station became an entrance not merely to a city, but to the American capital. Washington Union Station opened on October 27, 1907, and was completed in April 1908. Daniel Burnham derived its central pavilion from Rome's Arch of Constantine. Its main waiting room was modeled after the baths of Diocletian. The room measured approximately 120 feet wide by 219 feet long. Its coffered barrel vault rose about 96 feet above the floor. The dimensions were not accidental excess. A traveler entering the capital passed beneath a Roman-inspired composition associated with triumph, government, and imperial scale. Passenger circulation became a procession. The building placed ordinary movement inside the visual language of national authority. The station did not hide its historical references. It transformed them. Ancient forms were used to frame a modern transportation network. The same strategy had appeared at Pennsylvania Station through the baths of Caracalla. Two major American gateways borrowed Roman space not because trains were Roman machines, but because Rome supplied an established language for permanence, civic power, and monumental order. But railway monumentality was never limited to Greek and Roman classicism. In London, the Great Roof at St. Pancras was completed in 1868. It spanned approximately 245 feet and rose about 105 feet high, becoming the widest span roof of its type in the world at the time. Here, exposed engineering became a monument in its own right. Iron and glass formed an immense enclosure over the platforms, demonstrating what the industrial age could do with structure. The concept was later copied or adapted in Cologne, Berlin, New York, Boston, and other cities. The contradiction between historical masonry and modern engineering was often deliberate. The facade offered continuity. The train shed offered transformation. One spoke in the language of inherited civilization. The other spoke in the language of technical power. Once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. At Mumbai's Chhatrapati Shivaji Terminus, the former Victoria Terminus, construction unfolded over roughly 10 years beginning in 1878. UNESCO describes it as an outstanding example of Victorian Gothic Revival railway architecture blended with Indian architectural traditions. Its central dome, turrets, pointed arches, stone carving, and irregular palace-like composition make clear that temple-like cannot mean one literal architectural category. This was not a copy of a Roman bath. It was not a Greek propylaeum. It was a monumental hybrid shaped by Victorian Gothic and Indian architectural traditions. Rising above a railway terminal with the visual force of a palace, the style changed. The ceremonial role remained. London used a Doric gateway. Birmingham used an Ionic facade. Washington and New York used Roman imperial and bath models. Mumbai created a Gothic Indian composition. St. Pancras turned its iron roof into a technological wonder. Different cultures selected different historical languages, but the repeated purpose was similar: transform a system of tracks, schedules, and machinery into a gateway with civic presence. This matters because it prevents the mystery from collapsing into a false claim. These stations were not inherited ancient temples. Their architects, construction periods, owners, engineering systems, and materials are documented. They were designed for railways. The question is not who built them. The question is why societies repeatedly decided that railway travel required architecture associated with palaces, civic institutions, cathedrals, triumphal arches, and monumental public halls. Perhaps the answer is simply confidence. The station had to make the company look stable. It had to make technology look safe. It had to make investment look permanent. But there's another possibility within the same evidence. Perhaps the station was also understood as one of the most important shared rooms in the city, not a corridor between transactions, a public threshold. And, if that is true, the later simplification of these spaces was not merely a change in taste. It represented a different belief about what public movement deserved to feel like. To understand what was lost returned to the scale of the individual traveler. At Pennsylvania Station, a passenger did not encounter the railway all at once. The building revealed it through stages. The exterior colonnades separated the city street from the institutional interior. The waiting room placed the traveler beneath Roman-inspired vaults. Human figures appeared small, but they were not hidden. Their smallness made the room legible. It showed that the journey belonged to something larger than one person. Then came the glass and steel concourse. The material changed. The mood changed. Stone permanence opened into modern structure and daylight. The architecture connected two kinds of authority, the remembered authority of historical form and the immediate authority of engineering. Below lay the platforms and tracks, the part of the station that physically carried people away. The building turned this descent into a sequence. That sequence was a form of public storytelling. It told passengers that transportation was not a private inconvenience. It was a civic event. The individual entered a system shared with thousands of strangers, and the system was given space, order, and dignity. Washington Union Station performed a similar act. Its 96-foot coffered vault was far larger than required to place a roof over people waiting for trains. But the room's purpose was not exhausted by weather protection. It gave the Capitol a ceremonial entrance. The semicircular windows, monumental volume, and Roman references placed arrival inside a national frame. A visitor could understand the political importance of the city before reaching a government building. At Curzon Street, the surviving Ionic facade shows the same idea in an earlier, more concentrated form. 4 great columns stand before a revolutionary 19th-century building type. The railway is introduced through the language of an established public institution. The strange part is not what survived. It is what later became difficult to value. Modern accounting can measure passenger volume, construction cost, floor area, maintenance, travel time, and commercial return. These are real concerns. Stations must move crowds safely and efficiently, but the older stations were also built around effects that resist simple measurement. How important should arrival feel? How much beauty should be placed in a room used by people who may never pay to admire it? What is the civic value of daylight falling across stone? What happens when a public building gives an ordinary traveler the spatial dignity once reserved for courts, palaces, and religious structures? The industrial age was not uniformly generous or humane. These stations emerged from systems of capital, empire, corporate competition, and technological power. Their grandeur could advertise the companies that controlled movement. Monumentality could impress, reassure, and dominate at the same time, but it still created shared public experience. A person did not need to own the station to enter its hall. The architecture surrounded commuters, migrants, soldiers, workers, visitors, and families. It turned mass transportation into one of the great public theaters of modern life. When Penn Station's above-grade structure was demolished, New York did not lose the ability to receive trains. It lost a particular way of receiving people. When the Euston Arch fell in 1961, London did not lose the route to the Midlands. It lost the ceremonial marker that had announced that route since the early railway age. This distinction is easy to dismiss because nothing mechanical appears broken. The train arrives, the doors open, the crowd moves, the schedule continues. But architecture works before and after mechanics. It tells people how to interpret the space in which the mechanics occur. A narrow ceiling produces one kind of arrival. A 96-foot vault produces another. A hidden entrance produces one kind of institutional identity. 4 immense Doric columns produce another. The old stations did not merely contain transportation. They gave transportation a public face, and the disappearance of that face created a quieter kind of loss. The city continued to function while feeling less like the city it had intended to become. The dangerous question is not whether the old stations concealed forgotten technology or came from an undocumented civilization. They did not. Their construction histories are extensively recorded. The surviving evidence identifies architects such as McKim, Mead and White, Philip Hardwick, and Daniel Burnham. It records engineering programs, materials, dimensions, dates, and railway owners. The mystery is more uncomfortable because it belongs to documented history. Why did a civilization capable of building monumental public gateways later decide that the gateways could be separated from the systems beneath them? At Penn Station, the answer can be stated in practical terms. New York needed the railway. The above-grade building occupied valuable space. Madison Square Garden and replacement development could be placed above the retained and reconfigured station. New structural columns could carry the new complex through the underground levels. The decision treated the site as a stack of functions: transportation below, commercial and entertainment uses above. The monumental architecture between them was removed. From one perspective, this was efficient adaptation. From another, it exposed a profound change in values. The original station had joined engineering, civic symbolism, and passenger experience into one composition. The replacement separated them. The railway became something to maintain below the surface while the city pursued a different identity above. This does not prove that the destruction was part of a coordinated campaign against beauty. It does not prove that modern institutions wanted travelers to feel diminished. The record raises a question, not a conclusion, but the repetition is difficult to ignore. Euston's Greek gateway was ceremonial, publicly contested, and demolished. Pennsylvania Station's Roman waiting room was documented, monumental, and removed while trains continued beneath it. Curzon Street survived, showing how deliberately classical the early railway threshold had been. Washington Union Station retained its Roman-inspired role as an entrance to the capital. Mumbai's Chhatrapati Shivaji Terminus preserved a different but equally monumental vision of railway architecture. The pattern is not universal destruction. It is a conflict between two definitions of necessity. The first definition asks, what must remain for trains to operate? Tracks, platforms, tunnels, signals, circulation, structure. The second asks, what must remain for public life to feel worthy of the people passing through it? That question has no engineering minimum. A railway can function without a triumphal arch. A city can function without a monumental waiting room. A public system can function without carved stone, great windows, columns, clocks, domes, or vaulted light. But can function is a very low standard for civilization. The architecture of the old termini suggested that transportation was one of the places where society should reveal its highest ambitions. The station was where technology met the public body. It was where strangers became crowds, and crowds entered cities. The monumental shell made that encounter visible. When the shell was removed, the system became harder to see as a civic achievement. It became a service delivered through compressed corridors beneath other uses. One possible interpretation is that the industrial age needed monuments to establish legitimacy, while the mature modern system no longer needed to persuade the public. Once dependence was complete, architecture could be reduced because the passenger had no need to be ceremonially welcomed. Another interpretation is less cynical. Cities changed, land values changed, passenger volumes changed, maintenance and redevelopment pressures changed. Buildings designed for one era became difficult to adapt to another. Practical decisions accumulated until monumentality seemed incompatible with efficiency. The official explanation may be correct, but even correct explanations leave consequences. The loss of Penn Station changed preservation culture in New York, just as outrage over the Euston Arch helped strengthen conservation attitudes in Britain. People recognized, often after destruction, that architecture dismissed as an unnecessary shell had been carrying public memory. That recognition came too late for the stone. The most unsettling possibility is not that someone hid the truth about these buildings. It is that the truth was visible, documented and openly debated, and the buildings were removed anyway. The 22 federal photographs of Pennsylvania Station preserve more than the appearance of a demolished structure. They preserve a difference in ambition. In one image, tiny passengers stand beneath the Roman-inspired waiting room. The room makes the crowd appear small, but it also gives the crowd importance. Vast space has been constructed for their arrival. In another view, the glass and steel concourse reveals the modern system waiting beyond the stone. Historical architecture and industrial engineering meet without apology. A plan or section explains the hidden arrangement. The railway below street level, the monumental station above. Then the sequence ends in demolition. The walls disappear. The underground levels remain and are reconfigured. Columns are inserted to support a new world above the operating tracks. The city inherits the railway machine but rejects the architectural ceremony that once surrounded it. This is not evidence of an ancient, lost civilization. It is evidence of a documented civilization changing its mind. In 1837, London gave a new railway a Doric gateway. In 1838, Birmingham placed Ionic columns before a revolutionary building type. In 1907 and 1908, Washington transformed Roman imperial and bath architecture into the entrance to the national capital. In 1910, New York opened a station whose waiting room recalled the baths of Caracalla, and whose concourse joined glass, steel, and underground movement. Beginning in 1878, Mumbai built a Gothic Indian railway monument crowned with a dome, turrets, and carved stone. At St. Pancras, an iron roof spanning approximately 245 feet turned structural engineering into a spectacle. Across these examples, the styles changed, the political settings changed, and the technologies developed. Yet the station repeatedly became more than a place to board a train. It became the threshold through which modern life introduced itself. Perhaps that was the real purpose of the temple-like station, not to deceive the public into believing the railway was ancient, not to conceal impossible machinery, but to take something new, loud, dangerous, and disruptive, and place it inside forms associated with continuity, order, and collective memory. The railway company gained authority. The city gained a gateway. The passenger gained an experience of arrival. Then, over time, the railway stopped being new. Its tunnels became invisible infrastructure. Its schedules became ordinary. Its passengers became flows to be processed. The question is, what disappeared when the station no longer needed to inspire trust? Was the grandeur only a marketing device whose usefulness expired, or did those halls perform a deeper civic function that modern redevelopment failed to measure? When people protested the destruction of the Euston Arch, what exactly were they defending? 4 Doric columns, a familiar landmark, or the belief that entry into a public system should be marked by something more permanent than signage and commercial frontage? When Penn Station's Roman room was removed, what did New York gain, and what could not be placed on the balance sheet? The trains still entered Manhattan. The platforms still received passengers. The city still moved. But movement is not the same as arrival. A machine can deliver the body while architecture prepares the mind. The old stations understood that distinction. They used stone, iron, glass, vaults, columns, domes, and light to make the traveler feel the threshold between one place and another. Their destruction suggests that later generations believed this threshold could be compressed, lowered, commercialized, or hidden without changing the essential journey. Perhaps they were right. The rails remained. The system operated. Millions continued to pass through. But stand inside the surviving hall of Washington Union Station. Look at Curzon Street's Ionic facade beside the railway land. Study the dome and carved stone of Chhatrapati Shivaji Terminus. Then return to the federal images of Pennsylvania Station and the small human figures beneath its vaults. The comparison creates a question that no timetable can answer. Why did the industrial age believe ordinary transportation deserved the authority of temples, palaces, baths, and triumphal arches? And why did the modern age become so certain that it did not? The archive preserves the building, the railway preserves the route, but the ritual of arrival survives only in fragments. Perhaps the darkest part of the story is not that we forgot who built these stations. It is that we know exactly who built them, why they built them, how quickly some were erased, and how easily the city continued afterward. The trains kept running beneath the ruins, and above them, almost without noticing, we learned to arrive somewhere without being welcomed.